Hello, global gardeners. Hey, I have a great idea. Let's get your gardening week started with 90 minutes of gardening talk. Today, I want to focus on the lowly weed and how we approach it in our gardens. Maybe give you some ideas to make the whole weeding process much easier. That's the way I like to approach it. It's not working hard and trying to keep the weeding to a minimum. Hello to everybody from all around the world joining us today. I see that Jay has finally checked in. I was getting a little worried about you, Jay. Jay and Heidi are wonderful moderators, so glad to see that you just checked in. And today is one of those days that I think a lot of us are dealing with very harsh conditions in the United States. If it's not tropical storms flooding us, it's excessive heat. We've actually set high temperature records over the weekend. And so it's just crazy. A lot of us are enduring this. And it's these kind of conditions, in addition to all the other extremes, that seem to promote the weeds. When everything is going the way we want it to go, and maybe the way we're used to it in our garden, we can stay up with the weeds and everything seems to be okay. And then all of a sudden the weather gets weird, like it did for me earlier this year, with more rain than we've seen in a long time. And then the weeds pop up and they become a primary focus in our garden. What are we going to do about the weeds? Well, maybe by the end of this talk today, you might recognize that often we don't need to do anything about the weeds. Something that is too often forgotten by gardeners is that a weed is just another plant that's growing in the landscape. And the way I define a weed is a plant that's just growing in the wrong place. Any plant can be a weed. We generally think of weeds as those native plants in our area that pop up in places we don't want them to be. And often they spread and can take over an area, which is why the weed is seen as something that needs to be eradicated. But there are actually a lot of benefits to growing weeds in your garden. Now, I do weed my garden beds. I don't like plants in my raised beds in particular, in my vegetable garden. I don't like plants other than what I'm trying to grow in those beds. But for the rest of the landscape, I have a harsh environment. And if there's a plant that is willing to grow and able to grow, then I'm willing to let it grow. And it comes down to why we think weeds should grow, or why I think weeds should grow. And that's where the benefits come in. Bare soil really doesn't do any good for any of us. Bare soil is unhealthy soil. And so one of the first benefits to weeds growing in an area outside your cultivated garden space is that the weeds, plants, are covering the ground. And by covering the ground, they are actually working over time to improve the soil where they're growing. And so I have a big experiment. It's actually moved beyond the experiment stage, particularly in my front yard, but also in many areas in my backyard. I'm letting the weeds grow. My soil is really, really bad. And I'm looking forward to growing a lot of plants in the future, a lot more native plants, a lot more perennial plants. And my poor soil needs to be improved. Well, I could bring in and pay for huge loads in the dump trucks that would probably need to number 20 loads for me to get my soil to the point where I would like it to be. Or I can let nature help me by letting some of these native plants grow, the weeds. I'm improving my soil. A lot of those plants have really deep roots. And so in an area like mine with compacted soil, those roots are acting to break apart the soil. And in a poor soil region like mine with almost no nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium in the soil, those deep roots are absorbing those nutrients from deep in the soil, bringing them up to the surface. And then as those plants die every year or go dormant and die back in the winter, they're adding those nutrients to the top of the soil, and as the roots decompose, actually inside the soil. And those roots are aerating the soil, which is decreasing the compaction. So all of these plants I'm growing around my landscape are helping to loosen the soil and enrich the soil so that years from now, when I'm ready to put the plants in that I want to grow, all I have to do is get rid of those plants that at that time are growing in the wrong place. And then I put the new plants in. Weeds are great at controlling erosion. And I've seen this in my landscape. It's relatively flat, but I do have some slight slopes. Those plants that I'm allowing to grow that others might think of as weeds help keep the soil in place. It doesn't wash away. So as we continue, let's talk about some of the benefits for weeds and how maybe you might want to approach it. Frank says, I read in a Southern Living Plant Encyclopedia, a weed is a plant dealing with a person with an attitude problem, to paraphrase. I love that idea. Yeah, it's really only a weed if we see it as a weed. So it really is our attitude toward that plant that helps define whether it's a weed or not. I've made a video about dandelions. I think dandelions can be one of the best plants to grow in your garden. But I would say a large majority of people here in the United States spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of chemicals trying to get rid of the dandelions that really could be beneficial if you choose to recognize the benefits that dandelions can bring. And there are a lot of other plants that are beneficial as well. Dandelions, if you didn't know, every single part of that plant is edible. So you can eat it. It also has that big taproot that, for an area like mine, helps break apart the soil. It adds a great amount of nutrients. But one of the reasons I like letting dandelions grow in my garden is because they are among the very first flowers in spring, which means they're flowering when the rest of my garden is still asleep. And when the bees wake up and they're looking for food, they're finding the dandelions. And a lot of other beneficial insects I find in my garden on the dandelion first, especially ladybugs. The first ladybug every year I can find on a dandelion plant. And there are lots of other plants that fall into those categories as well. They're edible, they're helping the soil, they attract the beneficial insects. It's up to us to have the right attitude to learn what's growing in our area, and if it's something that really we don't need to worry about. We should take advantage of those plants that are actually growing. Garden to Kitchen says, however, we have a lot of invasive weeds here that crowd out the native plants, weeds and plants. And yes, that's an excellent point. That's why I say learning to identify the plants we have in our garden can really help us figure out if it's one of those good weeds, the kind that really helps to benefit, or if it's one of those bad weeds. I have bindweed that is attempting to get a foothold in my landscape. I consider bindweed one of those bad weeds. We're not eating it. It takes over. It can devastate the native plants and just take over a bed in no time whatsoever. So I do a lot to try to eradicate the bindweed I have in my front yard and backyard. And I can see as soon as that plant sprouts that it's a bindweed. And so I'm pulling it. I've learned over the years what the leaf looks like. I look to see how that vine is beginning to develop. And especially once I pull it, I know what those roots look like. I've developed that over time because I learned to identify a plant that I don't want in my landscape. And whether you call it a weed or not, it is a plant that has no place. And if you choose to get rid of it, get rid of it. A lot of other plants fall into that same category as well. And so when it comes to just weeds in general, it is a philosophy. It's your philosophy, it's your attitude. If you want to get rid of all of the plants outside your growing beds, go for it. It's your garden. You can do whatever you want with it. But I like to see some of those benefits that I can gain and let many of the plants grow. And then there are others that I will limit as to the location that I might allow them to grow. And then the others that I just flat out eradicate, like the bindweed. And so consider this the homework for the week. If there are plants that are growing in your area that you think of as weeds and you've been trying to get rid of them, go ahead and take that extra effort to try to figure out what the plant is, and then figure out if maybe it might have some benefits. The lamb's quarter is very prevalent in my backyard. Another edible plant. I personally don't like the taste, but I know many who do. And it's one of those that the rabbits like to munch on. Well, I use weeds as an attractant to the rabbits and those other pests I have, and I let them grow in the periphery of my garden. So the rabbits are eating some of these weeds that taste good to them and staying out of my garden. Another great benefit that you often don't think of when it comes to weeds. You're actually using them as food for some of those pests that would otherwise damage your plants. And so if you have an area that you can let some of those weeds run rampant and you have some of those pests that would be eating those plants, don't eradicate them. I see people that are doing what they can to get rid of their weeds and then also trying to do what they can to get rid of pests like rabbits. If you just let nature take its course in some back corner of your garden, you don't have to do either. Again, back to that lazy aspect of gardening. I just let nature take care of all that, and I don't worry about my rabbits. I don't care about the weeds back there, and it gives more time in my day to focus on the projects and the growing and all those other things that I like to do. Hi, Catherine Young. Thank you, Gardener Scott. I enjoy listening to you from Raleigh, North Carolina. I appreciate your knowledge. Well, thank you for that, Catherine. I do appreciate it. Thanks. Llama Llama says, we don't have a lawn. The majority of our 2 acres is a meadow of weeds slowly filling in the very dry, bare land. Wild lupin, dandelions, and a new tiny light pink flower that showed up in 2021. Absolutely. My front yard is naturalizing. That's a term that is often used. That's a term I use to the weeds, the native plants that come in. I put in the anchor plants, the bushes, the shrubs, and some of the perennial flowers. And then what else is showing up? Little sunflowers that are just absolutely beautiful. And some of those other plants that are in my landscape that are popping up. Some of them low ground covers, some of them a little bit taller. And so like you, I'm looking for what's new. And I had a new blue flower that popped up this year in my perennial garden bed. Not something I planted, but one of those weed seeds that blew in from somewhere, and I'm letting it grow and see how well it does. So I think that can actually add a really nice component to gardening, is take your land and let it go. And you might be surprised at how beautiful a landscape can become when you allow some of the native flowers to develop in your area. John C. says, in the UK, many plants that people look on as weeds are food plants for caterpillars of our most colorful butterflies, nettles and bramble especially. Oh, I love that idea. And that's one reason why I'm letting the plants that are showing up in my perennial garden bed continue to grow, is for that exact reason. I love the butterflies. I love the moths, and you have to have food for the butterflies and the moths. And often that's a weed. The butterflies in your area are typically either native to your area, or like here in the States, we have huge swaths of the country that are on migration routes of butterflies. Well, they need food, and often they need a particular type of food, like with the milkweed for the monarch butterflies. And so you can entice some of those butterflies to your garden by growing some of those foods. Well, if it's a native butterfly to your region and you're allowing the weeds, which are probably native plants, to grow, you're going to see more butterfly and moth population. And I think for gardeners in particular, that time we're in our garden doing another project, weeding, if it's one of those things we are choosing to do, and we see that butterfly just flutter right in front of our face, yes, that's one of those stop and enjoy the moment kind of experiences. And then, of course, some of us try to grab the camera and take the pictures as soon as we can. But I absolutely love the butterflies in the garden. Tennessee Nana says Sergei Butenko has a website and also an excellent book, Wild Edibles, that has easy identification and colorful pictures of wild plants and weeds. Thank you. I haven't read that book, and it's not in my library, so I'll add it to the list. Thank you, Tennessee Nana. That's always good. Heather Lawless is asking, can you tell us where to get photos of these weeds? I don't know what I have. And so there are a number of apps, iNature and a number of other apps like that, and you could just do a simple search. And a lot of those apps, you just take a picture. Sometimes it's not even a picture. You just hold your phone up to the flower and it will identify it. So that's an easy thing to do. Or like Tennessee Nana says, the book Wild Edibles can help identify some of the weeds you have. So yeah, just do a quick search for plant ID app or plant identification apps, and you should see a bunch of them pop up, and many of them are free. So can't complain about free apps that actually help you identify your plants. So Eric Townsend, a member for 6 months in New Hampshire. Nutgrass is a weed that's very tough to get rid of. Any ideas to get rid of? And so when you do have that plant that is a weed, it's growing in an area you don't want it to grow, and there are a number of them to include the nutgrass, and it seems like each region has its own plant that can be very difficult to get rid of. If you don't want to use chemicals, one of the most effective ways to get rid of large areas of plants is solarization, taking clear plastic sheets. And I'm talking 10 by 10, 20 by 20, 20 by 40. It all depends on how big an area you want to get rid of. And you lay the plastic over the ground, you anchor the edges so it basically seals it in, and then you just let the sun bake the soil. And it'll kill those plants. It usually requires months, so figure at least 3 months of the solarization over that area. It also kills the soil life in those top few inches of soil, but that can be effective to get rid of some of those pernicious plants that we consider to be weeds. And it works with Bermuda grass and a lot of those other kind of grasses that tend to spread with the rhizomes underground and are really difficult to get rid of. So look at solarization as an option to get rid of plants in big areas. Another great way to get rid of those plants in the wrong area is just patience and time. And this is the approach I take with the bindweed. I don't let it flower, because if it goes to seed, then you've got millions of seeds and you're never going to get rid of it. So you don't let it flower, and as soon as you see it growing, you pull it out of the ground. Now this is after you've made an effort to try to pull as many of the plants as possible, or like in areas with a lot of grasses, dig them out. But whenever you see a new sprout appear, pull that sprout right away. And eventually you can get rid of some of those plants in the areas that you don't want them to grow. So it's work. If you don't mind spraying chemicals, you can spray the chemicals and kill the plants. And most of those plants will be killed by most of the herbicides that we have access to. And so Gina raises a point, or Gianna, and I wanted to bring this up as a benefit to weeds. Nutgrass indicates clay soil with poor drainage. The only thing to do is pull out the whole thing in spring when the ground is soft. So thank you for that suggestion. But the point being that weeds do a great job of identifying the soil that we have and the growing conditions we have. You can actually identify what kind of soil you have by what kind of weeds you have. So like in this case, if nutgrass is growing, that helps indicate that you have clay soil with poor drainage. So if you change the soil composition or the drainage in this case, that might also help get rid of some of the plants. And this holds true throughout the landscape. You can see different plants appear as your soil either degrades or improves. And so it's fantastic if you understand how Mother Nature develops soil. She does it by the use of plants, the same plants that later on might become weeds, but as part of the soil building that takes place over many, many years, it's the plants that do it. And so those very first plants that appear in a bare landscape are the weeds, as we choose to view them. And they're often very small, and they're the kind that grow in very poor soil. Well, those small plants will decompose and gradually enrich the soil and grow again, and they're helping to enrich the soil. But more importantly, those pioneer plants that they're often referred to will collect the leaves that blow in fall, and they'll also catch some of the seeds that might be blowing in from other areas. So those first plants have a very small impact on the improvement of the soil. And then some leaves grow against it or blow against it, and those leaves also break down and decompose and help enrich the soil. And then a new seed blows in, a new weed or native plant that grows in better soil. So when that plant begins to grow, it also does its job of improving the soil. Those tend to be bigger plants with deeper roots, and they help break apart the soil and collect those blowing leaves and decompose and spread more seeds. And there are many generations of different plants that take place over time. So eventually, the landscape is rich enough that it can begin to support bushes and grasses, which will then help improve the soil even more to the point that it can support trees. And so that's basically, over a long period of time, how soil is built. And it begins with the lowly weed. And each of those plants can tell you if it's a sandy soil, if it's a clay soil, if it's a soil deficient in certain nutrients. Often it can tell you if it's a soil that might be high in other nutrients. So learning about the plant that is growing and what those plants need to grow can really help you identify your landscape. Because you'll see as you improve your garden, if you haven't noticed, especially if you're a new gardener, the weeds change over time. When you're just starting your garden, you typically will have a different kind of weed than you will 10 or 15 years later when your soil is much richer, much looser, and can support a greater variety of plants. So I just think it's absolutely fantastic when you think about the weed as a plant, and that can help you in your philosophy, in your attitude as to whether you let it continue to grow or if it's one of those things that you might want to get rid of. And Sari Lou is wondering about poison ivy. It seems to me that ivy is more proliferate than ever. And so I, I, I've lived in areas with poison oak. I've never lived in an area with poison ivy, but they're the same basic idea. And this is one of those plants that you might want to get rid of. My grandparents' house with a lot of poison oak, it wasn't worth the effort. It was growing in areas that they really didn't ever go to, except for during the summer when we kids would run through those areas. And I've had many, many terrible cases of poison oak. And so the first thing with all of these type of plants, but especially the ones like poison ivy and poison oak that can actually cause a physical damage to your skin, is, do you need it? Is it one of those things that you really want to get rid of? And if it's growing in an area that it's not causing a problem, even if it is growing worse than it ever has before, you might want to try to just manage it in the areas where you do have the damage, if you've got kids or dogs that are running through that area. And then you look at it as a plant. And not being as familiar with poison ivy, but what is it that poison ivy needs? And generally, as I understand it, it needs moist conditions, and it likes some shade. So that's why we often find it in forests underneath trees or along river banks. And so many of us have experienced much wetter conditions this year, and that could explain why a plant like poison ivy might be growing more this year than it has in the past. And so understanding that idea of how the plants grow can also help you figure out why some years it's worse than in other years. And maybe you can use that to your benefit. Matina says, I think of weeds as volunteer ground cover. Yeah, absolutely. That's the way I'm approaching it in my front yard. It's a ground cover. And in my backyard, in areas where I'm going to be adding beds and paths and borders, right now, it's exactly that. It's a ground cover protecting the soil until I can get to that project, at which point I'll take out those plants and then finish with my project. So yeah, I completely agree with you. It's a volunteer ground cover that I don't have to worry about. It grows in my area and it's doing great. More power to it. I'll definitely let it continue to grow. And so, Chris, welcome back. Good to see you here on Monday. Wondering if anyone has a good idea of what to do with ragweed. And so ragweed, again, think of it as a plant. The reason ragweed is a problem is because it makes us sneeze. A lot of people are allergic to it. And so if you can cut it before it flowers, then you're not going to have that problem. And depending on how much ragweed you might have, it might be a major effort. But where I've got my weeds growing, I treat it like a lawn, and I let it grow for a few weeks and then take my lawnmower and cut it all down as the flowers are beginning to form, and I'm cutting down on the potential for flowers and for those flowers to turn into seed. So ragweed in particular, if you can try to cut it before it gets to that point where it flowers, you might help yourself out a little bit. And that may be a lot of work. Eventually, you can eliminate a lot of these plants by cutting them before they flower, making so they can't propagate future generations, and eventually they'll die out as the conditions change with the soil. Mulching can often help cut down on a lot of weeds like that. And before you know it, you don't have that plant growing in your garden anymore. This is one of those things about weeds, and the main reason why I wanted to talk about them today is because I get a lot of questions about weeds and using weeds in your garden. And so I've got a few videos on my raised beds and how I fill my raised beds, primarily with the logs and the branches. But I've also made comments from time to time that when I put a raised bed on top of the ground, I may not dig over the ground. I'd leave those plants in place, put the raised bed over it, fill it with soil, and then go about my gardening. Well, there's this assumption that too many gardeners have that a weed just will magically sprout. And so when we're putting our garden beds in place, we need to eradicate the weeds. And the key to remember is it's just a plant. So if you have a pepper plant or a bean plant or a tomato plant and you put it on the ground and you cover it with 8, 12, 15 inches of soil, that plant is not going to regrow. Even though a tomato plant can grow roots along its stem, once you've pulled a plant from the ground and it's dead, it's not going to sprout and grow again. And so we can use a lot of these plants to fill our beds when we're first filling our raised beds. We can use them as mulch. We can use them in our compost piles. They're just plant material that we can add to the plant material we want in our garden, all of that organic matter, if you do it before they set seed. And so the assumption that a weed is automatically going to regrow after it's dead is mostly wrong. If the seed or if the weed is dead and it has set seed already, then yes, those seeds can sprout. They can germinate and grow. So using the plants in our compost, in our soil, however you want to do it, it's an option. It's a lot of good organic material that really can benefit the soil overall. Now, there are some plants, particularly those that spread with rhizomes. They might have the thick roots. And if you use those plants in your raised beds or in your compost or as a mulch, then they might resprout if they're not completely dead. So use weeds in a number of different ways in your garden to be sure that those weeds aren't going to spread. Make sure they don't have seeds, and make sure it's not one of those plants that can spread with the rhizomes or with a cutting off of that plant. And so my compost pile is mostly made up of the weeds that I clear out of some of the areas of my garden because I don't have enough of the plant material growing from the other beds except at the end of the season when I clean up my garden. So if I want to get my compost pile started early in the year, I have to use weeds. I have to use those plants that are growing early in the year to be able to get compost started. And so it's just a plant. It's just a plant. It's just a plant. And use those weeds like you would any of those other plants from your garden in the compost as a mulch, as an addition to the soil, and it really can increase the biomass that you're using. So, okay, let's see. Look above says high growing weeds like flax work as neighbor repellent. I like that idea. I've actually tried to play with that idea with some of the sunflowers that are popping up as weeds. I love the sunflowers, so I let them grow wherever they pop up. But yeah, some of those plants can actually become a fence, and fences can make good neighbors. So I like that idea. That's a great idea. Tony O'Neill from the Simplified Gardening channel is here. Hey, Tony, we haven't seen you in a while. So glad to see you here. And for those of you that have missed Tony, he just had a new video come out over the weekend, another potato video, and we all know Tony is a primary expert when you want to grow potatoes. So good to see you here, Tony. Thank you so much to have you on the stream today. Look above says, also flax is now feeding the hummingbirds. And so thank you for pointing that out. Actually, I didn't have that written down on the things I was going to talk about. I talk about in the weeds that are attracting the beneficial insects, but hummingbirds. I have the hummingbirds, couple of them right now in my garden, and I put out the sugar water, and I'm growing flowers for the hummingbirds. But what I've seen is exactly that. They're actually going to some of those native plants that are in my area that are flowering. When the others haven't appeared yet, it does offer food for the hummingbird. So thank you for that. I love that idea. And assuming you want hummingbirds in your garden, I think hummingbirds are among the best things to do. So actually, I guess that was a comment to Frank. And so our Chester County News says, sorry late, don't worry about being late. You can always catch up. Hummingbirds in my tobacco flowers. Good for you. Hummingbirds will feed on so many different flowers. And especially if hummingbirds are native to your area, they're more likely to feed on the native plants in your garden. And so adding a variety of plants. I tried growing some tobacco this year and it got beat up by the hail, and I think the deer actually ate my tobacco plants. So I was hoping to get some tobacco flowers, but that didn't happen this year. So can't speak from experiences to the hummingbirds in my garden, but tobacco flowers, that's good to know. I appreciate that. CJ Don says, other gardeners taught me what types of plants take over by introduction, like bindweed, which is related to morning glory, or Malabar spinach. I now know how to grow without letting them become a nuisance. Great idea. Absolutely great idea. That like I said before, learning about the plants that we think of as weeds really can help you get control over them. And recognizing how invasive they might become helps determine how much effort you put on. I spent a lot of effort on getting rid of the bindweed and no effort to speak of to get rid of the lamb's quarters and the I'm trying to think some of the others that I have in my area, the mallow. There are a lot of plants that I don't mind. Yarrow actually try to grow. I know for some people in my area, the yarrow is a plant that can become invasive if it's got the perfect growing conditions. I like growing it, but I've had patches before that I've had to trim around the edges and keep it from spreading. But that's a great plant to attract the beneficial insects. So in some areas, a plant might be a weed, and in other areas nearby, it's not. It's a plant that's growing in an area that you want to bring its benefits to. So that's how I approach it. Yeah, I don't like giving blanket statements about a lot of these plants, except for bindweed, because I let a lot of these plants grow in some areas while I'm actively trying to get rid of it in other areas. And so Canadian thistle seems to be the bane of your existence. Yeah, this is another one of those plants that I did attempt to grow some Canadian thistle, didn't like it, and worked to get rid of it. I did let it flower and go to seed, and it sprouted a little bit. And so the one area that a while ago I had tried to grow some thistle, thinking it would be beneficial for some of the insects based on what I had read, and got rid of it. A lot of those kind of plants that we have in our garden that become weeds are plants that we may have intentionally put into our garden, because there are a lot of those plants that start off as garden plants, and then they get in an area where the climate is ideal for them to grow, and they become invasive and the bane of your existence. And so that also is another reason why to think of weeds as plants. And anytime you add a plant to your garden, be ready for what could happen if it becomes invasive. There are plants, all of us, if you look into it, that have the specific invasive plants that are prohibited in your region. And so here in Colorado, I know that there are plants that seed companies can't send seeds to Colorado because they've been identified as potentially invasive. And it's best to avoid those plants by all means. But the reason they became invasive is because People put them in their gardens and then they escaped and then they took over. And there are lots of examples of that all over the world, of plants that were brought in and then became a big problem. So it's not a weed that's a problem. It's a plant that is growing in an area where we don't want it to be, and we've given it the opportunity to grow there most of the time. Skippy Dugan says, I learned the hard way. I have lemon balm and chives all over the place. Yeah, chives are a good example of that. They're a very hardy plant, and you let them go to seed, they can take over an area pretty well. I grow chives in my garden, same thing. I grow them in my garden under control, and if I see them start to sprout in an area I don't want them, I recognize the plant, I dig it up, and it's not a problem. Sometimes that does take extra effort. Hey, Chris, thank you for that contribution. Ragweed 16 feet plus. Wow. Thank you, Gardener Scott, for being you. Thumbs up all, please. Well, I appreciate that, Chris. I've never seen ragweed that tall. I think I've seen ragweed maybe 8 feet, but that's crazy. I can see why you want to get rid of it. And that's one of those that start early. Most of these plants, if you can catch them in the spring, like we were talking about earlier with the grass, if you catch them early when they're small, it's easier to get them under control. If you wait until they get established, until they spread, until they're big, it's a lot more work. So I spend more time in the spring dealing with my weed issue than any other time of the year. And then when they take over and it's out of control, I mow them down and I'll get back to them in the spring to try to clear out the areas that maybe they've invaded. So it is one of those things that can take too much of our time, which is why if you plan it, you really can reduce the amount of time you use. And Tony's saying bindweed, there you go. Coach grass and goose grass are the biggest issues. And so I don't have the coach grass and goose grass, I think probably because of your conditions in Wales, where I'm just too dry for that. But bindweed is just one of those that will grow anywhere, and I definitely want to get rid of it. Sari Lou has a problem with mint, which can be invasive. And yeah, so in my garden, as those of you know, I did a recent video on mint. I keep my mint under control by growing it in one bed that has the sides it can't escape from, and I keep it from flowering so that the seeds can't spread. And I've been able to grow mint for years and years and years without it taking over because I keep it under control. I recognize how it grows, and like any other plant in the garden, I keep it under the control that I choose by growing it in a bed and not letting it flower. So a lot of other plants can be that way. And if you deal with it, it actually works out pretty well. Gina says, hi, got parsley seed in my not hot enough compost, and now I even have it in my lawn. But that's okay. I finally have enough parsley for cooking. And so, yeah, so is it really a weed if you're harvesting it? I would say you got lucky in this case, and now you've got that parsley that you've been trying to get by allowing it to escape from the compost pile. So it all works out. It's one of the things that it's the benefit that we get from it. Most of the weeds that I have in my landscape, I get benefit from because they're a pretty flower. I like looking at them, and some of them are just outright gorgeous. We've got the Indian paintbrush that is difficult to propagate and actually grow intentionally here, but it can grow as a weed. So whenever I see that pop up, I do all I can to not pull it and to promote its growth because it is so fantastic. And the Mexican hat, I've got Mexican hat in my garden that started as a weed. It blew in from someplace else. I didn't plant it. I love the flowers on it. And so I actually waited till it seeded in that other area and collected that seed and then spread it all over. And some of those plants or some of that seed did germinate and grow into plants. So now I've got Mexican hat in my perennial garden that I didn't buy the seed, I didn't buy the plants, I just took weed seeds and promoted their growth in that area. So sometimes the benefits of the weeds really actually can be pretty good. Hi, Neil Sapp. Thank you for that contribution. Still learning about gardening. Thank you, Gardner Scott. I am still learning about gardening too. After all of these years and all these videos I make, I am constantly learning about gardening. So I'm glad you say that, because I think all gardeners should always be learning about gardening. And so if you say you're still learning about gardening, you could be a brand new gardener, you could be a very old experienced gardener, and that's one thing we've got in common. So you're very welcome, and I'm glad I can help it out. Oh, it looks like it's Nell Sapp. I'm sorry for saying that. I looked like Neil as I just looked at it. So Nell Sapp, try to get it right and recognize that you're learning about gardening. Keep that learning. It's so important. It's one of the things I wanted to mention. Was it 2 days ago, Saturday? So this weekend we had our plant or garden tour from our local garden club, and 6 of us offered up our gardens for the members of our club to visit, and mine was one of them. And it was so amazing to me. It always is amazing. 6 different gardens that were as different as you could guess. You couldn't write down on paper trying to guess what the differences would be. There were more differences than that. And these are gardens that are all within about a 5-mile radius. So same weather, same climate, same soil, different gardens from different gardeners with different approaches to gardening. And I learned from every single garden I went to. I got ideas, I took pictures, and I'm going to try some of the things that others are doing just down the road from me. So there's always something you can learn from gardening. And one of the best ways is to talk to other gardeners, make some gardener friends, and visit each other's gardens and learn from each other. And then, of course, YouTube videos and chats like this and all the rest. But keep learning however you want to do it, because there's just so much out there to know. None of us can ever hope to know a fraction of the potential of gardening, but we can try. And that's what I keep doing, is trying to learn as much as I can. Like Shandy's Garden says in caps, always learning. That's absolutely the approach I like to take and will continue to take as we move forward. Mr. Grimm says, a tip when pulling poison ivy, wash off using a mechanic soap with pumice and ice water. The soap is cheaper than the small tubes of wash. Ice water also keeps your pores closed. Interesting idea. Yeah, if you get the ivy or the poison oak chemicals on your skin, you do want to try to get rid of them as much as you can. So thank you for that. Pumice and ice water. I like the idea of the ice water closing the pores. I had, let's see, would have been 50 plus years ago, and was spending some time at my grandmother's house, the one grandmother in California. Terrible case of poison oak. At the same time that I was transferring to spend some time with my other grandmother in California. And the second grandmother had never been exposed to poison oak, didn't know how to deal with the poison oak. I have my back, because I was a kid, we didn't wear shirts running through the trees. My back was covered with the red skin that results in the eruptions on the skin from the poison oak. And she thought she would treat it with rubbing alcohol. And that's one of the most painful things that I've ever endured in my life, is trying to treat poison oak with rubbing alcohol. So I can tell you from experience, don't use that with the poison ivy either. It's not going to be pleasant. But ice water and scrubbing it off, I appreciate that tip. Thanks so much. So Skippy Dugan says, that's why I watch these YouTube videos. The technical information is all basically the same, but you learn new techniques and ideas that inspire me in my garden, period. So absolutely, thank you for sharing that. That's why I do it too. There's all, the basics are there. You put a seed in the ground, you take care of it, it grows into a plant, and you harvest it. Or you buy a plant, put it in the ground, it makes flowers that are pretty, and then it dies in the winter. Whatever. The basics are pretty much the same as to how plants grow and what we do with them. But the way we do it is just so varied that we have the sky's the limit. We can do whatever we want. And weeds fall into that category. I think it's an important part of our landscape, and learning how to approach weeding or not really can make a difference. I could spend an hour or two every single day trying to get rid of the weeds in my landscape. Or I can spend no time every single day and wait for those little flowers to appear and walk in, and some of them you can actually walk on and they have a nice aroma, and enjoy my garden space, look at the insects and look at the bees and look at the butterflies. Lots of time enjoying it, no time maintaining it. I think that's a win-win all the way around. So that's the approach I like to take. Heidi says, I guess I am blessed because I don't react to it, but my sister gets it. So I think you're probably talking about the poison ivy. My cousin was able to actually take, and he used to like doing this with his skin. He would take the poison oak leaves and rub them on his skin and wouldn't have a reaction to it. Until one time he did that without washing his hands well, rubbed his eyes, and then ended up with poison oak around his eyes. So some people have different reactions depending on what part of their body it's exposed to. So it is an oil, as the colorblind gardener says, and anything that removes oil will work. And that's one reason I think the mechanic soap is such a great idea, because it is actually formulated to remove the oils, and milk can work as well. But the expense is a big factor. Yeah, so if you can find the cheaper way of doing it to remove those oils, that's definitely the approach you want to take. So Gardens Happen says, if you get the capsaicin under your nails from hot peppers, use vegetable oil and dish soap to get rid of them. You might have to reapply a few times depending on how bad it is. So lots of good suggestions to help get rid of some of these things that we have to deal with in our garden, especially if it can be painful when we get it on our skin or in our eyes or any of those other places that we have to deal with. And so the using of the weeds in our garden, and the idea that they are a plant, and I show this in that recent video I did where I made the fertilizer using the dandelions and the stinging nettle and the comfrey, and got a lot of comments, and I've talked to people since who think of stinging nettle as a weed. And for some of you, yes, it probably is a weed. It does grow wild in many areas, and it can take over a garden, just like the dandelions can. So if you can find a purpose for some of those plants, like turning them into a fertilizer or adding them to your compost, definitely consider doing that. I'm not a big fan at all of weeding, and then especially with gardeners who have the assumption that all weeds are bad, and you bag them up and put them on the curb and toss them out in the trash. Rarely is that a viable option. Depending on the plant, depending on whether it's seeded or not, it might be something to consider. But it's usually a better idea to use that plant material in some positive way in your garden. And you can make fertilizer with it. You can use that biomass to help your soil, or you can just put it in the back of the garden. And there are many insects that will overwinter in plant material. Now, It's very important that you understand the insects in your garden before you take this approach, because there are many detrimental insect pests that will overwinter on our garden crops. But most of those are plant specific. And so I think we were talking about squash bugs recently. And so squash bugs and many others can overwinter in some of that plant debris if we just leave it sitting around. You might not want to use those plants in a big pile in the back of your yard. But if you're looking to attract some of the beneficials that do overwinter, find out what kind of plants they like. Many of them are weeds, and you might be able to allow the overwintering of some of those insects in your landscape. CJ Don is saying, slightly off topic, can diseased grow bag soil be sanitized through solarization? 35 7-gallon bags of soil, it's going to be painful if I have to throw it out. So yeah, solarization really can kill whatever's underneath it. And that includes fungi, bacteria, pests, and weed seeds. And so depending on what the problem is specifically and what the contamination is and what the disease is, often solarization really can be used to reclaim that soil. I would still, just because solarization, when you put the sheet of plastic over and heat up the area underneath it, it's one of those things that it's uneven. So some areas will get really, really hot, and other areas won't get as hot. And so I can't guarantee that everything is going to be killed. And so if it's a tomato disease, I would say go for it. It should work to really cut down on whether it's a fungus or bacteria, whatever kind of disease it might be. And then I would avoid, at least in the first couple years, growing tomatoes in that same soil, just to allow more time for whatever that problem was to work its way out. So if you can do that, solarize the soil, kill as much as you can, and then use that soil for a different crop in the next couple years, it shouldn't be a problem at all. I don't like wasting any of the potting mixes or any of the soil I have. So if you can find a way to do it, by all means, go for it. And it's it's extra effort, and so it's the balance of how much effort you want to take to solarize it versus the effort and expense of just getting new soil. Because you could take that soil and just stack it, pour it in rows in some area of your yard, and over time, that problem, that disease, will also be removed from the soil through the work of the weather and the work of the soil bacteria. Whatever that problem was will over time work its way out, which is why when we talk about rotating crops away from contaminated soil, you see everything from 3 to 7 years typically, because it will work its way out of the soil and no longer be contaminating that soil, but it can take a long amount of time. So cost, time, and effort definitely play into the considerations. And so while I'm thinking about it, let's go ahead and talk about the background today. This comes from Brian Siebert, and lovely garden space, long rows of wooden raised beds. I always love seeing gardens like this. That's one of the big benefits I find with raised bed gardening, is they just are so neat and tidy, and you can have the symmetry. If you look, you can see all the beds look to be the same height. They all look to be the same size. And so if you do want to rotate your crops from one year to the next, especially if you find that your soil is contaminated by a particular disease, you really don't need to change your plans and change your methods. You just move from the bed that you normally grow tomatoes in and instead grow beans in that bed and put your tomatoes in another bed that's the same size and the same height and in the same location in your yard. So that's one reason that I'm a big fan of these kind of gardens. But one of the things I wanted to point out, you can see the blue chair and the red chair, center of the garden, a nice sitting area. And you've heard me say this before, I love sitting areas in the garden. And so whenever I see a garden that has chairs in the middle, it tells me that's a gardener that likes to get out and just enjoy the garden. So especially if you're a new gardener and you're still in that phase of it's work, you're building, you're learning, you're struggling, get to that point where you might still be working, you might still be struggling, you're still taking all those efforts, but you're also taking some time to just sit in your chair in the middle of the garden and just enjoy it all. I finished phase 1 of my gazebo project, and I now have a concrete paver floor underneath my gazebo, and I have chairs in place. So I finally, after 4 years, have the sitting space that I want in my garden. Sometimes it takes time. I wanted that nice formal structure, the gazebo and the hard floor, but you can do what Brian's doing, a nice grass pathway and chairs just sitting in the center of the garden on the grass. It doesn't need to be fancy. You don't have to go to all the effort that some of us go to. It can be very simple. And let me move out of the way here momentarily. You can see directly where I was sitting in the front, the garden buddy, Brian's dog that is enjoying the garden. Another great thing to add. And so the last couple days, Mala and I have been sitting in the shade under the gazebo in the chairs on that nice floor that I built, and she's lying right there next to me. What's better than that? Your dog in your garden and just enjoying life for a little bit? Absolutely. So thank you, Brian, for sending the picture of your garden and your buddy. And note just the simple bamboo trellises for the tomatoes. Again, you don't have to go to a lot of effort. You can see on this side, the trellises look a little bit bigger, a little sturdier, but it all works, and that's what we're after. Brian's been having a big problem with the jumping worms, and so especially if you've got another problem, this is, if you look at the plants that are actually growing in the pathway, most of it is grass, but you can see what some might think of as weeds. They're just other plants that happen to be growing in the grass, and I bet you Brian's putting a lot more effort into dealing with his jumping worm problem than he is with some plants that are growing in the pathway. So it's green. It adds to your garden. It's that native ground cover that can help out. And it looks like the beds themselves are free of those other plants that we don't want. And I think this is a really nice looking garden, Brian. So thank you for sharing. If you want to share yours, send it to me, gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com, and I'll add it to the queue. It helps if it's landscape, and it helps if it's a full file size, and that really makes it show up better in the background. So do appreciate that. Llama saying, thank you for creating, leading, and fostering such an amazing community full of inspirational and informative people. Mondays are a true blessing. Well, you are so welcome. I just love being here. And you're right, it is an amazing community, and it's full of inspirational and informative people. So thank you so much for that. I get a lot of it too, just like this weekend, walking through other people's gardens and learning from other gardeners. I learn from you guys all the time. When I go back and look at the comments, you guys have a lot of good tips out there as well. Tulico16 says, when dealing with weeds, I make a point to cut them at the base and leave the root in the ground. It already has fungi network established, and when it decomposes, it aerates the soil and lets water in. Fantastic suggestion. Absolutely great idea. And I completely agree with you. so many of the weeds that are interfering in some of my beds. That's exactly what I do. I just cut it at the base. I'm not actually pulling the plant. If it's a plant I'm trying to get rid of, like the bindweed, I'll pull the roots out. But all those other weeds, you're exactly right. Leave the roots in the ground. The fungal networks are in place. And when you break apart the mycelia by ripping out the roots, you really are disturbing the soil quite a bit. So leave those roots in place. Great idea. And unless it's one of those kind of weeds that sprouts again from the same root, you don't have to worry about it. It just keeps on going. So Liz G says, nothing better than a Monday with Gardener Scott after a day in the garden. Fantastic. Thanks, Liz. I appreciate that. The Quiet Space Arts says we have community polytunnels here in Arkney at the hospital grounds, mental health awareness, etc., open to the public. Fantastic. I had when I was at the Galileo Garden, started working with some of the hospitals to help them set up some of their spaces. That's a subject I think a lot of hospitals are discovering, is having that mental health zone to go to, and it's often a garden. So great idea. And that's one of those things, if you consider yourself a good gardener, and that I think is a definition that starts pretty low. There's a lot of people out there that don't know how to grow plants at all. So even if you're a new gardener and you know how to grow some plants, you're a much better gardener than some of the people that might want help in the garden. And so a lot of hospitals are looking for volunteers to help out in their gardens in some of those mental health areas. So it might be something to look into. So always a way to use your gardening knowledge to help the community. So Jay Dixon says, I entered 30 exhibits in my village fall fair and one big. Good for you, Jay. I think that's fantastic. From vegetables to preserves. That's wonderful. That's one of those things I've never done, and I've been asked to, but and I may someday, is to take plants and jellies and things like that to the fair. So I have great admiration for those that actually do, because it is something that first you got to learn to do it. And I do a lot of preserving, a lot of growing, okay. But taking that next step to do what you do and put it out there for the public to see, that's fantastic. That's a big step. And I really do admire you, Jay, for doing that. Oh, there's Brian. I didn't see you in the comments earlier. Thanking everyone for the nice comments. Good news. Eliminated the jumping worms, at least where I grew my onions. Fantastic. I'm glad to hear that, Brian. So wonderful, because I know that's been a huge issue that you've been dealing with. So fantastic. Bowtie Life, nice to see you here on a Monday as well. Our church garden ministry grows food gardens and feeds guests at the medical center we host at the church building 5 days a week. That's a fantastic idea. Gardens just really are so easy to share with others. And you know the benefits you get from your garden. And to be able to share those benefits with others, that's fantastic. So thank you for sharing that. That really is a good idea. And Jeremy says, in my opinion, learning to grow food is one of the most important life skills to have. Completely agree with that. I'm looking, you may see it in a video. Most of the time I forget to take my camera, but my buddy Jason, who goes to the farmer's market with the stuff he grows from his garden, I'm actually planning on joining him this next Saturday at the farmer's market and take some of the stuff I've been growing to share with others. And so I'm thinking of doing a video. I've been planning to do this video for years. I just usually forget my camera. So if I can remember my camera, you may see a video of me traveling to the farmer's market and discussing the farmer's market and some of what I'm doing, but mostly what Jason does. So keep your fingers crossed for me that I can remember to do that. So Frank T says, if weeds do so much to improve soil here in Colorado, about 10 miles east of I think that's Glenwood Springs. Why is the soil still low quality when it comes to gardening? So, like I had mentioned earlier, it takes a long time for the soil to improve when you let nature do it alone. And so when you compare our soils, there are a lot of other factors more than just the plants and the native plants that are growing. Water is a huge factor. And so when you look at areas like here in Colorado where the soil is considered good, it's usually a low-lying area where there's more water. And so the plants can do better, more plants grow, more plants decompose, the soil is built at a faster rate. Whereas in the rest of the state, like in my area, where we don't have a lot of precipitation, we don't have a river, we don't have that water, the only plants that are growing are the ones who can handle the struggle, and they will break down and they do improve the soil. It just takes a lot longer when the soil is being improved without the presence of the water. Because all that bacteria that's breaking it down, all the fungi that's helping to improve the soil, they need water to survive. And so we'll have bursts in the spring where the plants are growing, they decompose, the soil gets better, and then it dries out and all the bacteria either goes dormant or dies until that cycle starts up again. Whereas an area that is continually exposed to the water, a stream, rain, a river, the soil's going to build up much faster. And so if you think about the areas of the world, but especially the United States, the areas that are rich in good soil, almost invariably, they are also rich in a climate that includes a lot of moisture. So that's a big factor, Frank, in why it's taking so long for some of us to actually get to the point that we can improve the soil. And so Masabi Gal is wondering about solarization killing jumping worms. And yes, it definitely can kill the jumping worms. And the best way to prep potatoes for storage. So if Tony is still on, I'll let Tony throw in his few words about prepping for the storage. For me, I just brush off the soil. I don't wash the potatoes before storing, and after they've cured, I brush off any loose soil and basically just put them into a cool, dark location for storage. But we'll see if Tony jumps in with an answer if he's still on, because he's the one that I consider to be a great expert in potato growing. Linda's wondering, what effect will wildfire smoke and ash have on plants? And so that's a good question. And a lot of it depends on the intensity of the smoke. And so last year we had a bad year. A couple of years ago we had a bad year where we just had smoke for weeks at a time. Couldn't even see the mountains. In some cases couldn't even see across the street. And so when you have smoke that intense, it affects the way the plants are growing. It's basically like the plants are growing on cloudy days nonstop. So they're not getting the sun and they're not doing as well as they would otherwise. So the smoke can definitely cut down on the vigor of plants because the plants just aren't getting the solar energy to grow. And that's the first thing that you're going to see. In an area with ash, the ash can actually cover the leaves and can actually choke out some of the plants depending on how thick the ash might be. It can block the pores on the leaves and can affect transpiration, so the plant isn't breathing and the liquid isn't flowing up and keeping the plant nice and erect. And so that can have a definite impact on the way plants grow. For most of these things, it's a short-lived event because the smoke will clear and the ash will dissipate and the plants will usually recover. So it might just lead to a bad season. Last year was not a good season for many of us here in Colorado, at least in my region, because we had so many smoky days. The plants just didn't grow as well as they normally do during our sunny summer. And so there's a couple things that you might want to take a look at. And particularly with the ash, you can wash it down. Oregon, I know there's some people on the chat today who lived through the Oregon fires last year. Same type of issues. If you have the ash on your plants, get your hose out and wash it off so it's not affecting the growth. But there isn't a lot you can do when the sky is just filled with smoke other than stay indoors or wear a mask. You shouldn't be breathing that in. So I hope that helps. Will, thank you for that donation. I appreciated it. I planted onions and hot peppers together. Onions did not work well, onions did well, not the peppers. Was it a mistake to plant together? I would say it was a great learning experience. Probably the biggest thing that we can talk about whenever we grow plants together is, are their needs being matched? And so onions and peppers have different watering needs. And that probably can explain some of the reasons why one plant does well and the other doesn't. Because if you water to the point what one plant needs, it might be more than what the other plant needs, or it might be less than what the other plant needs. So typically companion plants do best when they're matched together. And there's also slightly different nutrient needs between the onions and the peppers. And so that could be an issue. Peppers will do great when there's not an abundance of nitrogen, whereas onions typically can benefit from more nitrogen in the soil. So the nutrient levels in the soil might make a difference in how well one will grow from the other. And then the amount of light that the plants get. Now, onions don't need a lot of light, but if they were shaded out by the peppers, and depending on how hot you are, particularly in really hot regions, the onions might benefit from being shaded from the sun by the peppers. And so vice versa. You don't want to block the sun that's going to the peppers depending on how tall the onions are. So lots of factors involved: soil nutrition, water, sunlight, that could explain the difference. I don't think you're going to see that it's because the peppers make the onions grow. That there are some plants that do have an impact on other plants growing nearby, but you're not going to see that with most of the things we put out as companion plants. It's not like the peppers are preventing the onions from growing. It's just that they have different needs, and your particular bed didn't meet the needs of the peppers, or of the didn't meet the needs of the peppers. So your onions did well, but your peppers didn't. And it could be that the peppers just didn't get all of the nutrients and all of the light and all of the water that they needed. And the onions don't need as much. So they can get by and actually do well without all of the same requirements. So Pepper Chris says, once upon a time we were hunter-gatherers. Once we started farming, gardening, we got to settle down and start creating. We owe lots to plants. Absolutely. I think I agree with you. I think we owe a lot to plants. It's one of those things that we wouldn't be here if we didn't have the plants. And it's definitely something we should do what we can to be friendly to our plant friends. And gardening is definitely one way to help make that happen. And so Quiet Space Art says, I think I was told, remember that thought, that's what I'm going to end with today. I think I was told potatoes should not be next to tomatoes. Is that true? So, yes and no. So, potatoes and tomatoes are in the same family. They're pretty closely related. And this is one of those that I've heard as well. The planting of potatoes and tomatoes together could be a problem if the tomatoes have a disease, and that disease might spread to the potatoes. or if the potatoes have a disease, that might spread to the tomatoes. And so that's why you hear this. Don't grow them together, but it's assuming that you're going to have a transfer of disease. If you don't have diseased tomatoes and you don't have diseased potatoes, then they're not going to be transferring disease. And you could plant them close together. There are a lot of things like that, like for instance, my raspberries. I have red raspberries, yellow raspberries, and black raspberries. And what I've read says don't plant black raspberries near your red raspberries. Well, when you look into it deeper, it's because black raspberries could transfer disease to the red raspberries. I don't like to garden that way. First off, I like to try to keep my garden as clean as possible and try to keep disease out. And if a disease comes in, I try to identify it and then move forward from there. And so I'm not worried about planting tomatoes and potatoes together. You could also say they shouldn't be grown together because the tubers are going to interfere with the roots of the tomatoes. Tomato roots can actually get quite extensive. I don't think that's as big a deal. I think that it could be an issue depending on how you grow your tomatoes and how you prune them and how much you let them take over an area. And the same with your potatoes, what type of potato you're growing and whether it's going to take up a lot of space underground. I don't think that's as big an issue. I think it's more likely that what you've been told is because of a disease issue. And in many areas, it's a problem. Many areas of the UK, for instance, and this is probably why you're asking it, have historically had that continual problem with tomato diseases and or potato diseases. And so when you plant those near each other, there is that potential that you're taking the disease that's prevalent in your area and transferring it to the other plant that might not have been susceptible to it unless it was exposed to the potatoes. So it depends. In my area, I'm not that worried about it because I don't have the potato diseases that I think would be a problem with my tomatoes and vice versa. But you might. So you might be careful about how you are growing them close together. So let's see. Brian is saying planted tomatoes next to potatoes in the same bed this year, and the closest tomatoes have not done well. So, and it could be back to the nutrition idea that because they essentially need the same nutrients, they're robbing each other of those nutrients. And the potatoes are going to probably win that battle because they do have a little more extensive of a root system. So it could be that the potatoes were taking all the nutrients that the tomatoes wanted and weren't able to get, and so those tomatoes don't do as well. So that definitely can be a factor and a consideration. Okay, Paul saying, I had a bug eating the leaves of my tomatoes, so I put a potted potato next to it, and the bug left the tomatoes and moved to the potato. Great idea. I like that idea. Yeah, that's the other issue is the pests. When you have plants that are closely related, they often have the same pests that are going. So sure, sacrifice the potato to get your tomatoes growing. I like that idea. That's doing some recognition and a little bit of study and research and doing it all to your benefit. Fantastic. I always like it when there's these solutions like that make perfect sense, but that we seldom think about. And then Alora has a good point as well. They have different needs. Harvesting the potatoes would disturb the root system of the tomatoes. And they are typically harvested at different times. Your potatoes will be ready to harvest before your tomatoes will be dead at the end of the season. And so, yeah, that's definitely another consideration to figure out. And so Heather is wondering, can you please explain the details of sun scald? So sun scald is basically a sunburn on a plant, and different plants react differently. So I have a video where I show that I paint my trees with the IV Organics white paint. And one of the trees that I have in that video had sun scald on the one side of the tree that's facing the sun. It just got too hot, got too much sun, and it damaged the bark on that part of the tree. One solution to that is painting it white so that you protect the bark and keep it from sun scalding. During the summer growing period in our vegetable garden, you'll also see sun scald on your fruits and vegetables. And so it's probably most obvious and one of those things that most people deal with on tomatoes. The tomato fruit, and you'll see this in an upcoming video as I discuss it, the tomato fruit does not need sunlight to ripen. Many people have heard that you should prune the tomatoes so that your fruit gets full sun. If that happens, it can get sun scald. The fruit gets sunburned. It'll turn white or a very light beige or tan color on the tomato fruit. That's sun scald. And you can actually see the same thing appear on a number of other fruits and vegetables as well. When during the ripening process on the plant, it's exposed to direct sunlight all day long, it's going to be damaged. So that's the basics of what sun scald is. So just like if we are susceptible to sunburn, we do something to protect our skin. It's the same with the plants. On the trees, I paint it white. For my tomatoes, I don't prune so harshly that my fruit is going to be exposed to direct sunlight. I prune my tomatoes, but most of the tomatoes themselves, the fruit, are growing on the inside of the plant, protected from that sunlight, and I only have sun scald on the fruit that's growing on the outside that does get that direct sunlight. And so anything like that, you can see that same problem arise with cucumbers. You can see the problem arise even on squashes. Some of the more tender squash might actually get sun scald if it has too much of the sun. So shade cloth is another consideration. If you have hoops in your garden, you can go ahead and put shade cloth over the hoops, and that can be a way to help keep the sun off of your fruit as it's ripening and cut down on that sun scald problem. So, and CJ Dunn says, I made a video on sun scald. So there you go. We'll have to look that up. It's relatively easy to deal with. There's Jay right on top of things posting a link to one of my videos on how to protect your plants from weather, and I show some of how I use the protection over the hoops in that video. So thank you for that, Jay. So yeah, CJ Don says, I made a video on the sun scald I got due to the extended smoky conditions this year. On the first clear day, all my plants got burned. Yep. Just like that first day of summer, we go outside without sunscreen and we get sunburned. The plants are growing with the smoke. Like I said earlier, they're being protected. It's like a cloudy day to them. And then the sun comes out and the sun scald can result. So thank you. I appreciate that. And we'll have to look at that video. And so back to the idea of someone told me, or I heard, this is what I've been getting a lot of questions about lately. I heard that, and then they asked me the question. And so there's so much that we do in gardening, and we do it because we heard somebody say, and so I often get I heard that Epsom salts are really good for the tomatoes, and I'm doing that. Okay, well, as I said in a recent video, Epsom salts really aren't that great for your tomatoes. You don't need it. There are a lot of those things we do in our garden because we heard that it's going to work, or somebody told us. And so often I am sure if I were to ask the question, well, who did you hear it from? Or Where did you hear it? They don't know. It's just one of those things you hear. So much about gardening is we just hear it. Somebody talks about it, we think it sounds like a good idea, and then we act on it. And so I suggest to you, particularly as many of us are facing the end of our season, and some of you are facing the beginning of your season, whenever you hear something that's a new idea, before you do it, take some time and learn more about that. Watch my videos, watch Tony's videos, read a book, read a blog, and do multiple blogs, multiple videos, and multiple books if you really want to be good at it. There are so many things we do to ourselves in the garden to make it harder because we act under the advice of a person that we don't know. We don't even know if they're a good gardener. We don't even know if they're a gardener at all. They may just be passing on information that they heard from somebody else, and they may not even be passing on the accurate statement that they had originally heard. So take your time with gardening. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to do things wrong. But if we can prevent some of those mistakes before they happen by just doing a little educating of ourselves, I think it saves a lot of time and effort, and in some cases, the money. Some of those tips that I covered in that video, they can be quite costly to buy and put in your garden when it's just a total waste of time. So learn a little bit more about some of the tips you hear at this time of year and at any time of year when it comes to your gardening. And hopefully you'll save some money and you'll save some time and you'll become a better gardener in the process. So I will answer those questions when I get them, but it's one of those that I suggest before you ask me a question, because I heard, ask others and see what you can find out there to see if it's even a question you should be asking, because there's just so much about gardening with information that may work for one gardener and not work at all for another gardener. So hope that helps. Carry that forward into your week. Use the time ahead to learn more about what you're doing and what your garden needs and what your plants want. And that should help you have a better season, as for some of us, it's coming to the end. I don't like thinking that, but it's inevitable. The weeks are being counted down. It's always nice talking to you. It's always great seeing you here on Mondays. And like you probably already know, I'll be back next week. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.